My name is Omalara. It means wanted. But everyone here calls me Bibi for grandmother, including the masters of the manor. I am an old woman now, and my recall is not what it was. But of the things I do remember, I shall share with you. Perhaps it would be better served if I were to explain how I came to acquire both my name and my present condition. I was born of the Karanga in the Mutapa Empire, Zimbabwe, in the south of Africa. I was raised in the Zambezi Valley among much wealth and splendor. My parents were descendant cousins of the great Changamairi. They would tell stories of the king's court in all its magnificence and were well respected throughout the vast city and all its provinces. My father was a scholar and our village griot. He not only made known the oral traditions of our people, but he transcribed what was spoken into the written word as well. Much of my time as a child was spent learning. By the time I was 10, I could speak many dialects of Swahili, and I could also speak dialects of Igbo, Portuguese, and French. I was betrothed in my 15th year, married in my 18th year, and had bore this world 2 wonderful boys by my 21st year. Their names are Jamba and Isa. My 33rd year is when everything changed. The Portuguese slave catchers, called the Chikunda, they invaded most all the provinces save that of Batua, where the great Changa once ruled. I remember it was the rainy season, and it was my duty to tend to my mother's sister, who was with child. In the midst of my aunt's delivery, the slave catchers came, like a swarming herd. The Chikunda were slavers mixed with conquistadors from Portugal. They waylaid our entire village. They destroyed everything in their sight. The older men and women were massacred by the hundreds. My Bibi, my grandmother, and all the babus, the grandfathers, were slaughtered. I have never laid my eyes on my mother, my father, my husband, or my children since that day. That day, I lost my family and my freedom. More than 50 of us were marched down to the river. The youngest were tied together with rope. The older were put in iron shackles around their legs, and the strongest even with neck shackles, I remember. We were forced into canoes and taken miles up the Zambezi. I shall never forget my cousin Asani and the blood. He was stabbed in his gut and thrown over the side for spitting in the face of a Chikunda. Asani means rebellious one. He died, living up to his name. 2, perhaps 3 crocodiles seized upon him at once. They tore him limb from limb, and he was mangled to pieces in front of our faces. It was a horror that shall never be forgotten. We sailed 3 days upriver in the dugout canoes and transferred to a great melee, the name of which I cannot recall. We were taken below deck and were only allowed above the deck in the mornings for dousing and feeding. Buckets of seawater were thrown on us to cleanse the filth of waste and vomit which we spilled upon each other. Then we were fed some vile sort of porridge that only hogs should be fed. We sailed to the place called Madagascar, where there were so many imprisoned that I could not count. Every tongue you can imagine was spoken there. It was a market for the sale of human beings, and there could have been no more wretched place on earth than Nitaranarasi, which means the bad place in the language of the Malagasy. I was there more than 18 months. It became my duty to tend to the young ones, and they would attach themselves to me. I had to nurse their wounds, which came as the result of all manner of evil behavior. Though I was yet young myself, because there were no old people there, they called me Bibi, grandmother. One morning, before the sun came over the rise, after those many months, we were marched from the bad place out to the seashore. This time there were more than 100 of us. Once again, we walked up the plank of the Great Melee. It was the pink called the Charles. You could smell its filth from 50 yards away. We landed on the shores of America in the fall of 1685. This I know because I heard a Dutchman tell a Frenchman what the year was, and that the first organized street lamps had been put up in Amsterdam. It was my 35th year. I remember thinking, this is a primitive place, because every child knew that oil lamps had lit the thoroughfares of Mutapa and Timbuktu from the time of the first emperor. Every child knew that King Solomon's mines were in Mutapa, where the streets were paved with gold and the lamps were lit with whale oil and frankincense. I'm also certain it was the fall, because that was the first time I had ever felt the cold. It was as if the sun had no interest in this place. My bones ached from the cold and the rain. The first time I heard the word Phillips and kidnapper were in the same discourse. I would come to learn that my captors would be responsible for the enslavement of many, many thousand of my kinsmen. After some haggling and severe disagreements, a cruel burlap was thrown over our shivering shoulders, and 8 of us were placed in a wagon. It took half a day's journey to the place where I would spend my next 65 years. On the day we arrived, there was so much bustling about. The building of the large manor was underway, and there seemed to be at the least 70 men working on it. The Master Frederick, the Master Adolph, the Mrs. Margaret, and some of the native people were there to inspect us. There were tribesmen of all kinds, speaking different tongues, and slaves working feverishly, carrying wood, water, and other sundries necessary for the raising of the large mansion. After our inspection, we were taken to the creek where we bathed. We were given clothing and we were fed there. Immediately, I was put to work, carrying timber and water from the creek to the sawmill, and from the sawmill to the work sites scattered across the landscape. There were pelts being dried and stretched in this place, iron being smithed in that place, oxen dragging wagons in this place, clay being drawn from the mud pit here, clamshells shucked from the creek bed there, and carried to the kiln for firing over there. It was just all manner of movement, so vast as to make one think of ants scurrying about. We worked until the sun exhausted itself before we were taken to the slave shanties. The shanties were no more than a few boards of wood thrown together. There we slept until the sun rose, and we were put to work again. After more than a month of this daily routine, I was summoned to the manor by the young Master Adolph and the Mrs. Margaret. There I was told that my duties would be to tend to all the incoming enslaved children. They included making sure their wounds were tended and to also teach them in the ways of the so-called genteel. In short, I was charged with civilizing the savages as quickly as possible. I was moved to the back quarters in the great house, where I were given dresses and aprons to wear. It became my duty also to serve the master's guests when they were visiting, and there I would be privy to every stream of conversation. I heard Master Adolph say on more than a few occasions that God had favored him with the seafaring slave called Timber, the boatman. They would speak of him, and indeed all of us, as if we had no understanding, as if we were not human or perhaps invisible to them somehow. I believe they thought of us as cattle or sheep or horses. Of all the children who were enslaved here, it is Shola whom I miss the most. She was the sweetest child, with the voice of a Levite angel. Her singing would calm the restless soul and make even a wounded animal purr like a kitten. Isati, with her gift of language, was of all the children the most help to me. When I think back, so many children were uprooted, lost their freedom, and found their way to Marinick. The Phillips found a way to use them all to their advantage. I found a way to love them all. Some were sold off to God knows where. Some worked till their deaths right here. Some worked the upper mill. They all became family, and I have outlived them all. You see, we were not allowed to bury our dead at Sleepy Hollow with the whites. So we fashioned our own burial ground on the knoll just west of the upper mill. Some believe it is haunted by the ghost of those interred there. Some say you may hear them weeping and wailing on cold, dark nights. I have never heard such myself. I have made it my duty to visit there on Sundays, and to no one's knowledge but my own, I would take a small rock and carve the names of my loved ones to mark their graves. Timber and Isati, Shola are buried there. Olumide is there, and many more. I tell you this now as an old woman who no longer has the strength to climb the knoll and visit those loved ones. But I tell you this so that you would know that I have carved the name Bibi Omalara into a small rock, and it would serve my soul that when my time comes to rest, you would be so kind as to place me and the stone there, so that at least the earth will know that I too made a contribution, and at long last I now have my freedom.